All right, welcome to Shoot Me Straight. Dave Fields. Today we don't have Eddie. He's at a shooting course, teaching some guys how to protect themselves. Today we got Dr. Jeanne Allert. She's the founder and executive director of the Institute for Shelter Care. She works a lot with anti-trafficking at a really high level, has a lot to share. And so, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So give me just some background on you. How'd you get to a place where you're founding this? Did you have a background in human trafficking?
Oh,
Yeah?
I mean, you can't go there without a God story.
Okay.
But I was living a very nice, let's say, affluent, indulged, selfish little life in Washington, D.C.,
Okay.
making a lot of money as a consultant and just kind of living sort of a spoiled existence. And out of a happenstance, I joined this group who was doing a street outreach in downtown Baltimore to women in prostitution. And this guy said, "Hey, you should come." And I'm like, okay, whatever, I'll go. And it wrecked me. And I went with this group from a Korean Presbyterian church, and they are going down into the hood. You know, it was quite a scene. And, man, I just saw incredible compassion from these people. And I saw a part of the city that you generally just drive around. You don't pay any attention to. And that planted a seed in me, and that led to my having what I think now is a fateful encounter with one particular survivor. And her name's Heather. And she had a story that I learned later was a classic story in the United States. She grew up with a single parent. Her mom had some boyfriends, and one of the boyfriends took a real interest in her. And he left mom, but while she was 14 years old, he persuaded her to run away with him, and he proceeded to traffic her up and down the I-95 corridor for about 4 years. Then she's addicted to drugs, and after a while, she's of no use to him, so he drops her off in Baltimore, and she just becomes another, addicted prostitute on the streets of Baltimore and just sort of blended into a subculture. And hearing that narrative and sitting there on that stoop of Baltimore and listening to her for about 3 hours, it just created such an anger in me. Like, this can't be happening in my country. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Bangkok, and you'd think if I was going to be in anti-trafficking, I would be, in some country like that. But here it was, in Baltimore. And I just couldn't tolerate it. It just created what I call like a holy rage. Mm-hmm. And that led to a lot of changes. That led to me selling my company and selling my home and buying a property and all in. All in.
Wow. What a change, like, to have a story like that affect you in such a way that you completely change your life. Do you think God was involved in all that?
Oh, my gosh. In the forefront. Yeah. But I have to say now, because I'm 18 years in this movement, having that transformation in my life has been a key testimony with the ladies themselves, because this is a population that largely thinks nobody cares about them, nobody wants them, they're a discarded population, they're just property, or they're nobody's property and they're just used and discarded. And when they hear that somebody was willing to leave all the trappings of life for them to be, I didn't do it out of any kind of being pious. I was like, that's sort of free falling of faith right there. But for them to understand, why would you do all of that? Why did you care that much about me? You didn't even know me. I'm like, well, then we have to point to God.
Yeah. He did it for us.
Yeah.
How cool. So from there, when you sold the property, you go all in, chips in. Like, how do you even... Were you like, okay, what do I need to do? Like, how can I actually make a difference?
Well, and I think a fundamental part of the story is this was back in 2007. So this was even before the United States recognized sex trafficking as a problem. It wasn't until 2010 that the State Department even included an examination of the United States in the Trafficking in Persons report. So that was way before the awareness that has occurred since. And so there was really a tremendous amount of ignorance. But one of the other beautiful things, and I think that, we always say that God will equip the called, right? That shortly after I had bought this property, and I'm literally sitting on the front porch, I mean, it's giant 23 acres, big Victorian home. And I'm sitting on the front porch crying, going, now what do I do? Because I don't know how to do any of this. And shortly thereafter, I was out at another speaking engagement. And this woman at the end came up. Because in the speaking engagement, I kept saying this phrase, there's no such thing as a child prostitute. Because the language of the law says anybody under 18 is automatically a victim, not a criminal. So I kept saying that phrase, and this 40-something-year-old woman came up to me at the end, and she just sort of pointed her finger in my face, and she said, say it again. And I knew exactly what she meant. And I said, there's no such thing as a child prostitute. And her countenance just dropped, and she said, that's all I've ever been. And from that point forward, we became fast friends, and God paired me up with a survivor, somebody who'd lived it, somebody who from the age of 8 had been trafficked in the United States. I mean, flown to New York and been with people in D.C., and, you know, she knew a whole underground that I didn't even know existed. And so she became my Sacagawea in this land that I didn't understand. Wow. And without her, I don't think I could have done the work. Because she really not only acquainted me with the landscape, but also gave me the tools to how do you work with this population effectively. And I think for her, there was also this channeling of, I don't know how to be square. I don't know how to do what you can do. And I think it's just interesting that it's a great pairing. God took this woman who's like really sort of street savvy and rough and in addiction and all of this kind of underworld stuff. And then he took this person who was entrepreneurial and, polished and all of that. Like, let's throw them together and see what happens. Magic.
That's a good pair.
Well, it's a good pair.
Did when she pointed at you and said, say it again. Say it again. Is she, in a sense, do a lot of them not think that they're victims? Yeah. Is that kind of part of the problem? Is they think that, oh man, I'm a criminal, I'm a prostitute, I'm bad for, and they don't think, wait, this was done to me at a young age when I was 8.
Well, and I think one of the things that we struggle with is we try to understand the phenomenon from the mindset of an adult, and 97% of victims had experienced childhood sexual abuse. Wow. And so abuse was entered in very early in the majority of victims' lives. They're well acquainted with troubles. And with this kind of, we talk about grooming as if that's something that, is an external activity, and it can be, but it can also start at a very young age within the home. And so if you look at something like if dad's been molesting me since I was 8 years old, well, by the time I'm 15, I'm normalized. It's normal for me to be used by other people. Mm-hmm. It's normal for me to understand that my body is not my own, that I might have dissociative behaviors. I might move towards drugs and alcohol. I might have lots of, on the surface, bad behaviors in school, trouble with socialization, right? And on the external, we say, oh, that's a problem child. Because what we don't realize is the root cause points all the way back to that abuse and neglect at a very young age. And so that plays into what you're saying about identity and how people understand their experiences. If you think from 8 years old, well, if your daddy's raping you and he's saying you're just a dirty little girl, and that's what you've been told since you were a child, that's the way you see the world.
Wow. When I think of grooming, I hear you, but you tend to associate, or I tend to associate it as, slowly moving them towards normalizing. But in a sense, I guess, at a young age, that's grooming as well. Mm-hmm. That they're telling them, they're raping them, and then justifying it, telling them stuff, like creating a narrative. Mm-hmm.
It's a both and.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a both and. There's different forms of perpetrators. I just finished a couple of years ago an extensive study in the United States on familial trafficking, and that's essentially when the perpetrator is a related party. And I wanted to combat this question of, is familial trafficking something that just happens in Bangkok or South America? And that's what I think of a lot of Americans, assume that that's not a local problem. But around 2019, the Polaris Project, which runs the National Hotline, reported that familial recruitment was number 2 in the United States. The second most common form of recruitment into trafficking was familial. So that was another catalyst. So I took on this study, and it was a national study to look at the prevalence of familial trafficking, and the study was enormous. It was over 3,500 child trafficking cases across 24 different states, and the data yielded that about 26 to 47% of child trafficking cases are familial.
Wow.
So that means a quarter to a half.
Yeah.
The at least origin of the exploitation was within the home first. And 68% of the time, the mother was the person who granted sexual access to the child. Mm-hmm. So
like the mom knows it.
Mm-hmm. Is facilitating it.
Yeah.
Now, here's some things that you might find interesting, just think based on what you've done on other shows. The study also showed that the number one motivation for a biological mother selling her own child was for drugs. It had historically been economics, financial, and that's still number 2. But between 2019 and today, drugs are the number one reason. So you have to go into that mindset of here's this mom on meth, and she needs to get well, right? In drug language, right? Which
Sure.
means she needs a hit. And she's in that mindset desperate.
Yeah.
And so what's expedient? Somebody will take your child. Somebody will abuse your child. Somebody will make pornographic images of your child.
Dude, which if for a mother, you talk about, and honestly, no, as a drug addict, no real judgment on, like, I understand addiction, right? You put it above all else. And I mean, you go against everything in you.
Right.
You cannot stop. I mean, you're not complete victim, because you can go get help and you can work the steps. You can, it's not that your choice isn't not to use or not use. Like, you're never going to win that battle. But what you do is you go get recovered, right? Like, you go through recovery, and then you can't. Then you do get a choice there. So you're not the victim isn't not using. The victim is not choosing recovery. But man, for a mother, that has to go against every part of their grain, their children.
But I think to your point, being able to ask the question, how could a mother sell her own child? That's a sober question.
Mm-hmm.
That's not an intoxicated question.
Yeah.
An intoxicated question is, how do I get high?
Yeah. Yeah. And that one, I will say this, like, when you get in recovery, it's wild. It's like nothing you could do would stop you from using. But when you get in recovery, it is wild how that thought of using it's almost neutral. It just, the power is sucked away from it in recovery.
Yeah.
But man, so you pair up with this Sacagawea, right? Like,
Her name's Patty.
Your team, and y'all begin to, like, take on something that I think a lot of, even today, probably a lot of people still are like, maybe it's a problem, but it's not that big of a problem in the United States. How big of a problem really is it?
Yeah, it's so hard to put a number on it. And I ask, not so rhetorically, what number would compel you?
Yeah.
Like, if I tell you 2, is that enough? Or do I have to tell you 200? What number is going to make it matter to you? Unfortunately, it matters when it starts to hit your own household.
Yeah.
When your kid comes home and they have a friend who went missing, or there's stuff going on online and somebody's invading the sacredness of your home because they're online talking to your kid.
Yeah.
Right? Or kids being cyberbullied, or the stuff that's happening with all of the, sextortion on the phones with the kids. So once that starts to hit your radar, I think people are motivated to care. But prevalence numbers are really elusive. I'll give you just a smattering just for flavor, though.
Yeah.
So there was a study, and it's still under question, but it was about 2 years ago, came out of University of Texas at Austin, and they wanted to try to get at some prevalence numbers just within the state of Texas. So we're imagining how big that state is, right? And they estimate 72,000 children just in the state of Texas.
Wow.
Do with that what you will, but that's one study in one state. We have some states that really aren't looking at the issue enough. We asked last year for all of the offices of the attorney generals to send us their human trafficking reports. And some states aren't even producing reports, so we don't have that kind of data. We only got reports back from 24 states.
Wow.
So we don't know is the big question. But you know what I would submit to the folks who listen to your podcast who are parents? Just ask your kids. Just ask your kids, and maybe not come right out and say, do you know anybody who's being sex trafficked? That might be too sophisticated of a question. But just asking some questions about, do you know anybody who's being forced to do things they don't want to do? Do you know anybody who, is keeping a secret with an adult? Do you know anybody? Yeah, and just there are lots of resources on the internet where you can find prompts for how to talk to your kids. And I think parents would be shocked, just like we're shocked now to realize how much our kids are watching porn.
Yeah, for sure.
Because we'd rather cup our ears and think it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Wow. If 72,000 in Texas, can you imagine? I'll say it, California. Can you imagine?
Exactly.
Like other states?
Right.
And even then, I imagine on doing some of those studies, that's got to be like one of the hardest studies to really get even accurate information from, because a lot of stuff, like, how are you going to get that information? It's like when some of the political polls that come out, I mean, and those are got to be 10 times easier to do, but it's like, man, who's really telling people like who they're voting for, and like, the person at the mall.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm definitely one who doesn't want to be making hyperbolic statements, that I can't substantiate, because that just discredits the movement entirely. But I'm very intentional about pairing up some things that we do know to try to get to a better understanding. For example, there's a lot of literature around childhood sexual abuse, and we've got a reservoir of studies. And some of the findings out of that is people who were molested as children generally do not disclose that abuse. By and large, they don't disclose. When they do disclose, more often than not, it's a 24-year gap from the last abuse to the time that they seek somebody to talk to. So somebody will keep that secret of that abuse for 24 years on average. They'll most often disclose when one of two things happen. Either the perpetrator dies, and so that individual finally feels safe enough to say something. Or the other prompt, often with females, is when your own children become the age that you were at the onset of abuse. And that creates a psychological trigger. And oftentimes we see people who have a break, right, mentally, because of all of that flood that comes back. So those two life prompts happen later. So to your point, we've got a whole population of people who are not talking about their abuse.
Yeah. We've even had it on our podcast where we've had a lot of guys too. There's been a lot of guys
think even more men keep it a shameful secret.
Yeah. And then we had one guy, and now he's literally right now on a road trip, like similar to you. He went all in, and he's speaking all over the place. But he was 20-something years old when he got honest about being molested when he was 5, and like almost to date on that 24 number. But he in breaking through that. And what's really cool though is like when he's done that, he's brought his kids along. He even had his boy here in the podcast studio, and like watching him go on a mission of trying to help others with the wrong they had done to him.
Excellent.
Which is, I mean, that's the light side around it, of getting freedom around it.
Right.
Like your friend that came forth, and have you seen her grow and recover a lot?
Absolutely. And I think, we know it to be true that we have to take what's in the dark and bring it into the light. And I think that's a big part of the recovery process. And what I've learned in working with survivors is not only is there a tremendous amount of shame, a sense of being disenfranchised from society, that you're really not even a full participant in society, so you're not even entitled to engage in the same ways. And so they're kind of persona non grata. And what we have to do is create an invitation yet again for them to be fully integrated back into society. So some of the stuff we do in recovery, the practical things like housing and job skills and vocational, that's all great. The meatier work is the interior work around how does she see herself? How does she see herself in relationship to God? And how does she see herself in relationship to others? And those oftentimes, much like in the medical sense, when you have to break a bone to reset a bone, that's the really hard work, is you have to break the mindset to reframe the mindset. She's not a dirty little girl, even though she's now 30 years old, right? And that has to be dismantled to be rebuilt. Does that make sense?
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, their self-worth has to be, and that's so ingrained. I mean, that's, for some of those women, 30 years, or and especially, you probably know, like, things that were ingrained in you as a child tend to be, I mean, they're so deep. They feel like, for sure it's true. Even though you can have all the facts in front of you, but still there's that deep down identity that has to be changed.
Right, and you mentioned boys, specifically for boys who were molested as children. More often than not, the perpetrator is a male. And the identity conflict that boy has to then walk out is, am I a homosexual because that happened to me? And particularly if during that experience, their body responded the way a body would.
Yep.
But that creates a cognitive dissonance of, now I don't know who I am because my body's betrayed me. Or maybe I actually liked the attention that I was getting from the perpetrator. And that creates a real conflict because I hate, but I like, and I'm a child. What do I do with that? Well, that you carry that forward, and what we see in the manifestation, particularly with men who have had that experience, is they're going to approach it one of two ways. They're either going to become very angry men, angry against the world. Everything has to be a fight, a conflict. And that doesn't necessarily mean violent, but it can be their approach to everything is with this rage, right? Because that's what's unresolved. Or a surrender, which is, I guess because this happened to me and I can't reconcile it, then I have to surrender to perhaps a lifestyle that I actually isn't authentic for me.
100%. So I've never met anyone else that has seen that observation. So when I was working with addiction homes, I would do, they're called fifth steps in the 12-step program, and I would do these fifth steps where you go through guys' sex inventory, their past resentments, all that. And I mean, I did hundreds and hundreds of them, and I would see over and over and over again a guy that had I think it is so prevalent, especially among addiction community, that when they were younger, they had some experiences where another guy touched them. And I mean, at that age, it's like the wind blows and it feels good. So it's like,
that's right.
And so they thought, oh, this was wrong. This was gay. This was homosexual. But it felt good. And it shouldn't have.
That, right? How do I resolve that?
And as a kid, you don't really have you haven't really developed enough to understand it from like a third person view and so you just in a sense think I shouldn't have liked that, but I did. And so then they hold it in, and then sometimes it'll act out later. And sometimes they'll keep that in the dark and it'll just grow. And then when they get older, when they quote unquote come out of the closet, and this is not every single case. I'm not saying this for every single case, but they will quote unquote come out of the closet and they'll feel this relief. Well, that relief is because they've held this secret for years and years and years. This relief isn't because that's who they are or that's their identity. And so for guys, of seeing them come to realization of like, wow, that wasn't my identity. And wow, like now as an adult, I do think they're victims, but I don't think they're in they can't stay in a victim place in a sense. It's like now you're 30-something years old. Yes, that did happen to you. Yes, that was wrong. But now you have the opportunity as an adult to look back on that and heal that and look at it and go, okay, that wasn't my identity. I misinterpreted that.
Right. And it may just be a semantic, but being victimized is not your choice, but victimhood is your choice.
That's a good word.
And we have people who, maybe for lack of psychological resources and social supports, defeatedly choose victimhood as a pathway. It's the path of least resistance. And, that's pretty tragic. I think one of the things that's been a joy in my life in working with trafficking victims is they truly are some of the strongest people I've ever met in my life. They've survived things that I can't even fathom. And one, it's been a great personal work on me because, man, I just shut up all my whining. Like, I got nothing to complain about. And so that's good for all of us. But then on the flip side, to just be in the company of people that you truly admire. Because as one survivor said, the really strong people are not the ones that have conquered something you can see. It's the ones that are fighting battles you know nothing about. Ooh. It's powerful. That's a survivor friend of mine out in California, so shout out to her. But I've learned so much from them based on insights like that and seeing that these are people who have triumphed over sometimes impossible situations. I grew up with a great dad. My dad was Dick Van Dyke. I mean, tripping over the sofa and everything. Like he was great. He was present. We did scouting. He was an all-in, all-American, middle-class, mid-America dad, right? And to imagine not having that, right? The fatherlessness piece that we talked about earlier before the show, or to have a dad who assaults you is so far beyond my imagination, because I know how precious it is to have a father and how having a father shaped my identity as a female. And it shaped the way I interact with men. It's pivotal. I think I really believe that we're in a manhood crisis in this country on epic proportions. And I don't think we would see the pornography if men were called to be men. I don't think we would see the divorce rate. I don't think we'd see the child abuse rate. That's my magic wand, if I had one, right? Would be that men would reclaim their rightful place in the home, in society.
Yeah. Yeah,
so thank you for doing something with it with your show.
Doing my little part. But like I think of, or me and Eddie's, I think you nail it there. I hear guys talk about feminism this, feminism that, but I think it really is manhood crisis, right? Like having good, strong, healthy men. I do think strong, not instead of, I think we have a lot of weak men right now that stand up, do what's right, that aren't. I love how Jordan Peterson.
Oh my gosh, I'm just thinking the same thing. Be a monster.
Yeah, dangerous but under control.
That's right.
And I've learned a lot about that through just martial arts like jiu-jitsu. Some of the absolute killers that I know are some of the nicest, compassionate, humble men.
Right.
That would destroy you in a second.
That's right.
But
strength under
they're
control.
under control. It actually humbles you. It does the opposite.
Well, and I came up through. I was, middle class, middle America. I'm a young girl and going to college. Well, of course, you're going to become a teacher or a nurse. Those were my choices back in the 60s and 70s, right? But coming up through education, I can see now retrospectively that in many ways, some of the systems that we've architected emasculate men. We take young boys who just innately don't sit still. Yeah. They just don't. But we make them. Right? We've built an education system that's really very feminine, instead of honoring the differences and letting boys be boys. And I don't mean that in a bad behavior way. I mean in the way that they're genuinely wired.
Yeah, 100%. I got a 5-year-old, and he's all boy.
Yeah, all you have to do is go to a playground, and you can see there's a difference.
There's a difference. And I love how you put that, honoring it, because you want to honor the females too. I have 3 girls and 1 boy. The 3 girls, they can sit there and they can draw my 9-year-old, she's writing a book right now, and I'm trying to get her to like wait to read it to me, but like she wants to read me every page right now. She's writing it, but like they can sit down and do that stuff after they spend a whole day at school. My boy, he gets home, he's like ready. He's got guns, he's got Nerf guns, and he's running around the house. He's ready to like just tear it up. Yeah. And both of them, I want to encourage both of them in those. Have some bumper lanes for control around it, but that you want to build them up into their differences. As you started the institute, how did you really get women start coming there? How did you start coming up with like a program of recovery for them?
The survivor leader that I mentioned was instrumental in the design of the program and the pathways of recovery, and a lot of the structures that I didn't know were really important. For example, she spoke loudly into a lot of structure, a lot of discipline. And that's up and against contemporary society, right? Contemporary society said, oh, you should let the victim decide. You should be very victim-centered. The survivor knows what they need. And she's like, they don't know what they need. That's like telling a kid, what do you want to eat? And they want to eat, cheese fries and Red Bull. Like, no, that's not good for you. And so she said, a lot of structure, but you would know that in addiction too. You don't, and we have 79% of survivors are also dealing with addiction issues. So it's a co-occurring trauma and addiction. And so she advocated for a very structured approach where you have minimal services, you minimize the number of choices that a person has to make in a given day. And that's not restrictive in the sense that it's actually more compassionate because they overwhelm easily. You're trying to get sober and somebody's like, what do you want for lunch? And you're like, I don't know. I've had women who've never made themselves a sandwich, they don't know how to navigate a kitchen. They went from being a kid to being property, right? That was passed around. And so they don't have some of these basic skills. And then there's a lot of shame for not having that. So we really have to go back to basics with a lot of things. And so in the recovery program, we try to be extraordinarily individualized because I've had women come into the program who had a third grade education. Okay, I'm going to have to recalibrate all the things that I have that are written down or all the things that are multi-sequenced, right? I'm going to have to break that down. And I think that was God's plan of putting an educator in that space because I think that way. But then also looking at ways in which people can have small incremental successes, little bits of mastery. And if, it's like Jordan Peterson says, make your bed, right? Or the who's the guy that did the commencement address, right? That did on YouTube. That was like, make your bed. But if that's the win for today, okay, we're going to celebrate that win. And then tomorrow we're going to make the bed and do the laundry. And, and you just calibrate based on the needs of each person. Some come in and they are dealing with an awful lot of mental illness. They may have a lot of pharmacology that's got them all mixed up. And so we're going to walk a longer period of detox and sobriety and then learning what it feels to feel, which is a huge part for survivors. They often learn at a young age to numb, whether that's with substances or dissociation, right? Just check out. And those behaviors, we always say those are tools that were in your toolkit that kept you alive, but they're not tools that are going to help you going forward. So we need to put new tools in your toolkit. So a lot of teaching of coping skills, a lot of different emotional regulation and response. But I would say socialization is also something that is a big deficit area. They're not, oftentimes survivors are not in situations where they've gotten the same socialization that we expect in middle school and high school. Many of them didn't even go to high school, right? 8th grade is about the most average that we see them drop out.
Wow.
So sometimes we do fun things like, I'll just give you a couple of examples that I just thought were super dear and treasured memories for me. When you have a gal who comes up to you and she's like, what's a slumber party? And then I'm immediately thinking about, 5th grade, 7th grade, my childhood. And I'm like, you've never had a slumber party? She's like, I don't even know what they are. And I'm like, well, then we're having one, right? Okay, we're having one. Complete with taking the mattresses and surfing down the stairs. We did the whole thing. Or, taking fully grown women and taking the tarp outside and covering it in water and body sliding, down the hill. We kept track of, we put one of those giant Post-its on the walls in the hallway, and it said at the top of it, first time I ever. And we just allowed them to, anytime they experience something new for the first time, just write it down, just share it. And I'm telling you, you would cry to see this. First time I ever had a birthday party, I'm 22, right? First time anybody ever said, I love you, right? First time I ever held hands. These women have been raped repeatedly. First time you've ever held hands? It's tragic, but it's wonderful, too, that you get to be a part of some of those new birth experiences. Mm-hmm. So recovery is, I hear it all the time, recovery's messy, but you know that. But it's also glorious on the day-to-day because you get to be a part of seeing that those new spurts of growth that happen in different areas of their life.
Yeah. It's wild. When we were running recovery homes, it was so hard, right? I mean, there's days you're just like, oh my gosh, like it's just overwhelming.
Every day.
Because you're dealing with it every day. But like in a week span, you see more miracles and cool stuff happen that you almost get accustomed to it, and that you tell anyone else about it, and they're like, oh my God, like that's like a lifetime experience you had this week. I'm like, I have this multiple times every week. Like, and you get to just be a part of watching people grow and break things that have held on to them for years.
Mm-hmm. It's part of living dangerously.
Yeah,
right?
It is.
Go into the fire and do some good. And that's been a real privilege. Some of us, like you, get thrust into it. Yeah. I guess I kind of did too, get thrust into it. But yeah, the rewards are tremendous. Now, we ran the restorative care program, the residential program, for about 13 years. And then we got to a point where the nation was beginning to understand more about human trafficking. So you think around 2014, 2016, a lot more awareness campaigns, posters showing up in the bathrooms, things like that. And so America's consciousness sort of woke up to this problem. And at that time, our organization made a shift to not doing direct care, but trying to raise up the next generation of people who are going to do this work. And so that's what we focus on now, is working nationally to raise up shelters across the country and help to equip them with not only what we've learned, but also prepare them for the upcoming different forms of exploitation. When I was doing shelter care, things like marijuana wasn't legalized in as many states. Yeah. So that wasn't a concern for us, but that's something they deal with now. When I was doing shelter care, TikTok didn't exist. Right? We didn't have OnlyFans. We didn't have as many college students in sugar baby, sugar daddy relationships across the country. We don't have, what we have now is, girls who, even in affluent homes, are selling pictures of their feet and saying, why should I go to college, right? I'm making $15,000, on selling pictures of myself, per week. Why would I want to go out and get a startup job at Chick-fil-A, right? And so we've got this movement towards what we call self-exploitation, and that's on the rise. So I think trafficking is going to continue to look different, and we just have to try to stay ahead of it, and that's what we're doing a lot of at the Institute, is what's coming and how do we prepare because the wounding isn't going to go away, even though the shape of the crime continues to change.
So when I talked with Bruce gave a really good example of if it's a river, right? He's like, we're down here picking people out of the river. Mm-hmm. But at some point after, you're rushing trying to get as many of them as you see come across and get them out. But at some point you're thinking, hey, I need to go up to the top of this river and see who's putting it in.
Right.
I need to stop the source. Like what would that, is that going and looking at like men in pornography or it, like what, how do you really stop that source, like of people getting in trap, like you're recovering them out, which is awesome because those people matter that are in there now. But how do you really address the source?
Well, not so flippantly. I'd turn that back on you and say, how would somebody have prevented you from getting into addiction?
I don't know.
Exactly.
It's tough.
It's complicated. I think there are some things that are obvious, right? There's a moral problem. There's an access problem. There's a lack of punitive measures and consequences problem. So any one of those fronts should be tackled, and we are failing on all three. So I would say to your audience, pick one, right? Now, not so flippantly, I would also say it has to start at home. You were telling me your story before we started, and there's so much. You started in the home. You started with your family, and you knew that was more or less the genesis of when it all started to go different. So we have to start in Genesis, and we have to start with the home. And it's bothersome to me that parents, I see a lot of parents who want to be their friends of their kids. And I've had more than my fair share of survivors in our program who are so angry at particularly their mothers, because 70% of our survivors didn't have a father in the home at all. So that's part of a problem. But their anger towards their mothers, I don't want you to be my friend. I don't want you to get high with me. I don't want you to be the cool mom. I want you to be a mom. Be my mom. Do your job. And this is from girls who have gone completely sideways, and they can trace it back and say, I needed my mom to be my mom and tell me no, because she didn't bother when I was not coming home at night. She didn't ask me who I was with. I'm not blaming mothers. I am one. But I'm saying we all kind of know when it starts. I had an occasion one time where I got the survivors together, and I said, okay, we're going to do this little focus group kind of thing, little game, the teacher and me. And I put up 3 Post-it boards, and I did green light, yellow light, red light. And I said, so what I want you to give me some feedback on is, what were the real early warnings? It was still green light that people missed. What was the yellow light where things are starting to go bad and you know it, but it's still people are not slowing down? And then what was the red light that said, you don't even see that it's gone sideways? And it was fascinating to hear their contributions. I'll give you just a couple of them. Oh. Consistently, what this sample of survivors said was a change in music was the green light. When I went from what I used to listen to as a kid, and now all of a sudden I'm listening to this music that is degrading, violent, degrading to women, right? She said, and they would say, and nobody picked up on it, right? And nobody told me no. A yellow light was change in friends. When I wasn't going to my church friends, or I wasn't with my sports friends or whatever, and all of a sudden I'm with either older friends or friends I knew my parents wouldn't approve of. That was the yellow light. And then the red light was having money that nobody was asking about, right? Using drugs, and nobody's, like, oh, she's not out of bed. She's not going to school today again. What's going on, right? But just not even picking up on things that were, let's say, physical evidence of change. And I just found that was fascinating, because they could point back to, this is when it started. Mm. So I want to be careful to say that don't anybody take that and say, oh, I'm not going to go through my music selection, of my child. Wouldn't be a bad idea. But it's not the prescriptive answer. But I think we all know that it starts in those small ways. And if we're not vigilant about catching the small things, we'll be dealing with the big things.
Mm. I love how you started with the home. And, I mean, the father, possibly, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, possibly the most number one, I think, issue, maybe, or manhood crisis, like fatherhood crisis, where you have a strong, loving father who is proactive or just active in raising his kids, active in spending time with his daughters, with his sons, and then the mother, right? And what do you think, like, just the relationship between the father and the mother and how that bleeds off into the kids? How important is that?
Well, have you ever heard that adage, the most important thing a man can do for his kids is love their mother? Mm-hmm. I think it's absolutely true, because in particular, well, both of your children, your daughters and your sons and your daughter, they are watching how you two relate. And that's how they are learning about relationships at a very formative age. They're learning about conflict. They're learning not only about affection, right, but conflict and resolution and forgiveness and unity. It's critical. A few minutes ago, you talked about your daughter writing this book and how eager she is to read it to you. I'm not chastising you, but I'm telling you, the more that you give her that affirmation, the more she gets her identity and her reward from you, she will not need to go out and find it from somebody who's more than happy to praise her and stroke her and buy her things.
Yeah.
Groom
her.
She doesn't need a daddy, air quotes. She already has a father. And that's a huge insulating factor. I think in the manhood crisis that one of the things that we've moving away from too much in society is giving men the opportunity to not only be dangerous, but to have an adventure, to have something that's a conquest, that is that's difficult. We've made too many things too easy. And I don't think that we have sold marriage and family as an adventure, as a challenge, as something that requires a warrior spirit. Even the church is not particularly good about that.
Yeah, maybe one of the worst.
Well, yeah. But I want to say a little bit more about going upstream and manhood and whatnot, because I was talking about familial trafficking and the mother being 68% of the time the perpetrator in familial trafficking. The second most common perpetrator profile is mom plus boyfriend. What our data found was that when the dynamic was mom plus boyfriend, in 70% of those cases, not only was the child being molested, but also being used for the manufacture of child abuse material for pornography. So in those cases where it's mom plus boyfriend, it is the act and the residual effect of the manufacture of pornography. Now, that dynamic is fascinating to me, and it requires some more study. But what I also think is if you look at other research and kind of lay them side by side, there is a lot of research now that is showing that the primary way that pedophiles are getting to their target children is by going on dating sites and looking for single moms. That's the number one strategy right now. So what we have in our mind of getting a job at the school or hanging out in the playground or becoming a coach, right? No, the online is the playground. But they're not going directly after kids. That's a problem. What they're doing is they're trolling around for single moms, and you can go on any social media site or those dating sites, and she's putting up pictures of her kid. Well, he's going to go to mom to get to the kid. He wants the 8-year-old girl, but he will pretend to have a relationship with the mom to gain access to the child. So that mom plus boyfriend dynamic is something that I think we need to pay a lot more attention to, maybe even in the area of social services. For example, we asked these law enforcement professionals who were identifying these cases of familial trafficking, what they were seeing in the environment. And they were seeing often, this situation of mom's got a drug history. If there's a dad, he's probably incarcerated or he's MIA, right? There's usually instability in their housing, meaning they're moving around a lot, or there's poverty situations. There's domestic violence situation. But they weren't asking the child, for example, about, do you like mom's boyfriend? How many boyfriends does mom have? Is this a revolving door? Let's find out a little bit more about what is the environment that child is living in that might suggest greater risk for that child to be, whether it's molested by that third party or being used for the child abuse material.
I mean, it makes sense when you say that. Right. But man, I've never thought about that. They'd go after a single mom. Mm-hmm. Wow. And God, there's got to be, in dating sites and then find them on the dating site, then probably look at their Instagram or whatever.
Exactly.
And begin to
Exactly. In the early days of the anti-trafficking movement, there were a lot of questions talking about going upstream. And the question was always, well, what are the vulnerability factors, right? What makes somebody vulnerable? and I think, my goodness, people are online screaming their vulnerabilities, right? They're announcing them from the rooftops. You don't have to be terribly clever. You know, you've got, I read one study, this was a couple of years ago, but it just made me laugh a little, but not so much, that the population that is the most disclosing online is a 13-year-old boy. They are, and you would think probably a teenage girl, but a teenage boy, an adolescent teenage boy was statistically more likely to share more information that shouldn't be shared. Their address, personal information, where their parents work, the comings and goings of people in their household, things like that. That's screaming vulnerability, and it's fodder for the people who want to prey on children.
Oh, wow. That's what that's, to me, I'm like, there's so many facets of it. It seems, do you ever get overwhelmed with this stuff? It's absolutely overwhelming because you're all in. All your chips are in. You're fighting for this.
I'm ruined. I can't do anything else. I am completely unemployable at this point.
That's awesome. But like it's so tough. Do you feel like in your life you see some momentum, like you talked about with your girls, and I think it's mostly girls, right? Like you don't have guys.
We took minors and adults, but only females.
Okay. But you set up for them a program where it's like, some of the best place to be in is small wins, momentum, right? Build momentum. For my life, for your life probably. Is that hard to get in your life? Is some momentums and some wins where you're just like, man, I feel like I'm punching air. I'm not getting enough. I'm not making enough of a change. This isn't turning around.
I think as we now hover over this field nationally, I can say that is one of the preeminent challenges for people doing the work, people in the trench doing the work, not getting the fruit of their labors, and not often enough, that's dispiriting ultimately, because people are called into this work or feel compelled into this work, or they've had life experiences that draw them into this work, but they do it because they want to see life transformation, and they want they're feeding on hope, right? But what we try to do is encourage people that this, like parenting, is playing the long game. This is not a sprint by any stretch of the imagination. So I'll just share from a personal perspective. I did residential care for 13 years, every single day, 24/7. You're all in, right? There, you have no other life. I don't begrudge a moment of that, but it was extraordinarily difficult. Now, fast forward, it's been, I'm in my 18th year in the anti-trafficking movement. And last year in 2021, for whatever reason, God put me in a situation where it seemed like everything in my life calmed down. Everything got quiet. I was almost in, you might call it sort of like that desert place. Oh, I hated it. I had been sucking on so much adrenaline for so long that I was in a bit of a whiplash. So I was not in a good place about it. But here's the thing that was so amazing was in that year, I had no fewer than 13 survivors from the past who found me again. I'd already relocated for business reasons and whatnot, but they found me and they just wanted to reach out to say thank you. And I'll tell you one particular story that's touching, but it speaks to parenting as well. So this gal writes me this email. I hadn't seen her in 7 years. And she's like, hey, Miss Jeanne, I'm so glad I think I found you. I'm just so glad I found you. Please watch this video. I have some good news to share with you. And it's a video of her out in a park playing with these two little kids. And those are her kids. And she said in her letter, I'm married now, and I've got my two kids, and life is really good. And I just wanted to say thanks for some of the things that you did for me. She goes, most importantly, I wanted to thank you for taking me to the library. Okay, I'm an English major. I'm kind of a nerd. Of course I'm going to go to the library. And the library's free. Of course we're going to the library, right? Well, what I didn't understand at the time was, and she said in her letter, girls like me don't get to go to places like that. We don't belong there. We're not welcome there. but you were so stubborn that you were going to take us anyway. And now I take my kids to the library. To know that that's such a small thing, but it's such a huge thing. To know that little thing that I did just because it was how I was raised, you go to the library. Books are good, right? It's part of a community. To pass that along to them, but now it's being passed on generationally. I believe that what the Lord is saying to me now is, Jeanne, the reason that this is a time of quiet is because this is the harvest for you, right? And just sit down, shut up, and enjoy it. Self-talk here. But I think that if we can play the long game, like I said, much with parenting, if you're expecting your 7-year-old to appreciate you, you don't understand the job, right? They're not going to appreciate you at 17 either. But at 27, you might get a glimmer of, hey, you know what, Dad? Thanks for the sacrifice that you made. Thanks for doing what you did. And that's the way we have to approach recovery, is we have to play that long game and trust that the little things that we do along the way are going to bear fruit in the long run.
That's a good word. That's an awesome word. Hey, thank you so much for coming on and sharing some of this stuff. If people want to help you, support you, be involved in any way, what would you recommend? We'll leave links down in
Yeah, that would be terrific. They can certainly go to instituteforsheltercare.org, and we have some resources out there. We're primarily an organization that is trying to equip and support the shelters, so we can absolutely connect you with anti-trafficking organizations in your area, and they need support and volunteers and whatnot. You know, we would love financial support as well, because we are trying to do as much for them as we possibly can. We want this field to be excellent, and that requires an investment, and so I would appreciate that.
Yeah, 100%. So they can, so Institute
For sheltercare.org.
Got it. So we'll leave a link down in below for that. And then I think in just all the little nuggets of wisdom that you gave along the way, I think if they want to reach out and talk to you or ask for help, is there a way to get a hold of you or your staff?
Sure. I'll give you my email address. You can put that in the links as well, but
Okay.
It's just Jeanne Allert at instituteforsheltercare.org.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you for going all in for the families and kids and people that you had. You did not have to do that, you know. In a sense, I relate a lot with your story, because in a sense it's like I had a choice, but I had no choice after going through what I did. Mm-hmm. And so, but man, you are fighting for not just the kids, but for the families and the future generations. So.
Well, before the broadcast, I accused you of being like the Apostle Paul, and you will remember that at one point he said, you know, as far as preaching the gospel, I can do no other.
Yeah.
And I'm at a place where I could do no other.
Yeah. You're ruined.
I'm ruined.
Awesome.
Living dangerous.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right. Out.